So I want to make this video today because it's a video I wish I had when I started my Linux journey. Now, I was already been a Windows user for over 2 decades and was an advanced user. And going to Linux was probably the hardest for me. So the more technically competent you are with your Windows box, the harder the transition to Linux is. It's one of those things that not very many people tell you, because if you don't know anything and you're just looking for a computer with a web browser, Linux is going to be super easy transition for you. However, if you do a lot of gaming, you do a lot of technical work, you do a lot of different program work, and you have an entire suite of things, well, you almost have to learn alternatives and other things and how it works in Linux compared to Windows, because they never work the same. And this video is for you power users out there. And it's one I wish I had when I started my journey, because it's a hard switch, especially the more competent you are. First off, let's just qualify and set expectations, because there's a lot of lies in the Linux community, and something that a lot of neckbeards do and when I say neckbeards, that's your veteran Linux user, and these are people that exclusively use Linux for, probably 5+ years. And these people have lost touch with what the experience is like in Windows and Mac, so they don't have any basis. They don't purposely mislead you. They think they're doing a Linux justice, but a lot of times they scare off new users like you because they tell you lies. They don't know they're lying, but they're lying. And the first thing off, does Microsoft Office, Adobe products, and every game work on Linux? The answer is hell no, they don't work. Yes, you can download like a 2013 version of Office, the full version, install it, and then tweak it to kind of get it to work, but some pop-up windows might be black and they can't quite render properly, and you're going to sit there and waste probably a day or two messing around with it. Yeah, it can kind of work, but no, it can't. Just straight up, it cannot. Just let's stop telling people it'll work and it won't. And if you're trying to use always online, always updating software, forget about it, especially when it comes to Microsoft Office and Adobe. So those are the things that some Linux people will tell you, oh, well, Photoshop works if you use the pirated version that's encapsulated from, maybe Photoshop circa 2017. There's a special version in there that you can kind of get working. Yeah, let's not do that. Not at all. Let's just straight up just say, hey, Adobe Photoshop will not work. So let's not steer people the wrong direction. So now that I've ranted on about that and you understand the gaming caveats, the big thing about gaming titles and anti-cheat for the qualification here, yes, some things on ProtonDB show that they're compatible, but sometimes it's without the online component. There's always like little things that get you, or let's say you're doing like heavily modded things, that's also going to be a much more difficult thing to accomplish in Linux. The gaming experience will be harder in Linux than it is in Windows. Almost every time, except for older games and emulation, it actually will be easier. So if you're playing something more than 10 years old, chances are it's going to work better in Linux than it does in your Windows counterpart. So there are benefits to it, but for the most part, all your new like AAA titles with heavy anti-cheat and their online competitive shooters, you're going to have a hard time. Now, we've qualified you. You understand the qualifications to switching to Linux, and you want to just jump right in, format your hard drive, and say, screw you, Bill Gates and Windows, I am done. Hold on there, fella. I know that's where you want to go, and I know the Linux neckbeards are going, yeah, delete Windows. It's just awful. I get it. Don't do that. That's awful. First, get yourself like a Raspberry Pi. That's a good one, or even better yet, launch a virtual machine, install Hyper-V or VMware Workstation, or even VirtualBox. I'm not a fan of VirtualBox on Windows. Launch into Linux at least once or twice. Really get familiar with the CLI and some of the nuances to Linux, because if you just try and cold turkey switch, there's just so many differences between Linux and Windows, you're going to have a bad time. So first, set up a test box, whether that's a virtual machine, whether it's a physical. Raspberry Pi would be a good alternative. So now that you've done that, choosing your distribution. Where do you start in Linux? There's 1,000 different distributions to choose from. Which one do you start with? It really doesn't matter in a lot of instances. Some people will have their flavors, but a lot of people knew starting out, hey, which one will be easiest for me? And really, there's going to be some that are better starting points than others. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to customize and kind of tinker a bit in Linux to get it exactly how you want. Linux Mint's usually a really good starting point. You'll hear people mention that quite often. If you're wanting to do more gaming, I've always recommended Bazite because it has a good starting spot, but there's always little gotchas. I think really I would recommend someone starting that is technically adept to start in either Debian or Arch. And I think those two are what most things are based off of, what almost everything uses at some point in time, like SteamOS and all that. Well, that's just Arch with Valve's little fancy skin slapped on top of it and some tweaks. So these two distributions really what makes up the thousands of distributions. There's some nuance to that, but for starting out, let's simplify it for you. Choose Debian or Arch. They're the best. They are the king of all Linux distributions. And understand what a distribution is. When you say Arch or Linux and all these other things, what are you talking about there? This is where understanding the Linux lingo kind of comes in. It's not like a distribution like Windows 10 to Windows 7. That's fundamentally completely different operating systems. Debian and Arch are more of Linux with extra components tapped on. When you think of Linux, think of everything can be changed. For better or worse, everything can be changed. You want to change the bootloader, change the bootloader. You want to change the desktop environment, how everything's displayed, change it. You want to just rip out and have no control panel. You don't want to have anything, and you just want the terminal. You can do that. That's Linux as well. So like Linux is a lot of things, and all distributions is someone picking all those things for you. So why I say Debian or Arch, one, everything supports both those distributions. I mean, almost everything. And it's what most distributions, it's probably 90% plus of the distributions are a fork of these two distributions. And they're just fantastic. So they're great starting spots. But let's jump into the differences between Debian and Arch so you can understand which one to pick. So there's something called rolling releases, and then there's stable releases. Now, I know some people are like, well, I want the stable release because it's more stable, right? That's what most new players coming into the space want. Well, a lot of technically adept people kind of want the latest and greatest bleeding edge, and that's not a stable release. Stable releases typically have really old packages in the package system. So let's say you're in your system. You're over here. Let's just clear this out. And you want to install something. So you could actually use, and I'm just using this as an example. You don't need to know the syntax here. Use a package manager, which right now I'm using Yay. You could use Paru. You could use Pacman. There's a lot of different ones for Arch. This is Arch based. And you can use that to install pretty much any program. Well, Arch makes it very easy to install the bleeding edge programs with just a click of a button. So if you can think of a program, Arch can probably install that latest version very, very quick. It's the beauty of a rolling release. The downside to it is it can also install the latest version that could have bugs and it's not tested very, very easily. So it's a give and take. So if you want this, Arch is probably what I'd recommend. But if you don't, and you just want it to be stable every time, but at the cost of it being 6 to 12 months older than what is, prominently out there, then you probably want something like Debian. So those are the two big things, and that's really what you need to know about stable and rolling. Stable is obviously more stable, but you use older software. Older versions of the software you'd use on a rolling release. So just wanted to hammer that home real fast. And now understanding the intricacies of this. And when it comes to Linux, there's a lot of prepackaged stuff, which I talked about. But I want to kind of break that down so you can kind of understand it a little bit better. And also notable differences between Windows and Linux. Every Windows user that comes over tries to make Linux work like Windows, and that's not going to work, and you're going to have a bad time. So first off, drivers. You don't need drivers in Linux. It either works or it doesn't. Do your research before jumping on Linux, because there could be incompatible hardware in your system. Now, again, Linux neckbeards will steer you wrong here and say, everything works better on Linux, install Linux. Not true. Some things just don't work very well, and some things do work very well. And you won't really know until you install it. So I recommend dual booting starting out, like have a second hard drive, install Linux on that hard drive, and see what kind of nuances you have. Now, when it comes to drivers, there are a few things that do have what's called kernel modules, and that's like a driver, but this should be the exception, not the rule. Meaning, yeah, if you have an NVIDIA card, you could install the kernel modules to get it going, and it's sometime in the future that will get baked into the kernel because they have open source most of their drivers, so that will eventually make it into where you won't have to do that anymore. But as of today, as the making of this video, you still need to. But past that and maybe like some firmware for your network card, you might have to install like a bulk network firmware driver to get two things working. But for the most part, everything should just work out of the box without installing any of these things. So drivers shouldn't even be a thing in Linux. And there's just a few exceptions to that rule, but just know that out of the gate. Most things should just work, and the sweet spot I find in Linux is stuff that's about 1 to 2 years old. If your hardware is complete bleeding edge, you're going to have a bad time in Linux. It's just not going to work all that well right out of the gate. Almost every time I've ever had a brand new day one CPU launch or a GPU that I've installed the day or the week it's released, it's a bad time. I know there's some exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, that's just the experience of Linux. As far as GUI stuff in here, like when I'm configuring things, the terminal, like when I look at the terminal and let's say I'm looking at setting my resolution, I like to do everything from the terminal. And I know that drives some Linux people, and you're already running back to on Titus. You can do it with a GUI system. Yeah, this is true. So like I could set it right there with xrandr, but there's also something called like arandr. And some of these things will switch depending on the renderer system you have in your Linux box. But for the most part, you can set it here. And let's say I want to change like the resolution. I can click this, set it, and then just run this and actually spit it out. But a lot of times these GUI tools are built after the terminal. So everything is thought of the terminal first, GUI second. This is completely different from how Mac and Windows are designed. Mac and Windows are designed for your average user that is, hey, let's set up the graphics, and then usually there's an interface to send commands to it through PowerShell or whatever. Linux, everything's done with the CLI first, the command line interface first, and the GUI stuff is built afterwards, which means the GUI stuff is not as well implemented as it is in other operating systems. So I always say there's always going to be a time where the GUI fails on you, but that's okay. And you just can fall back into the terminal. And there'll be one time that happens, and then you're like, okay, so if you're just scared to death of the terminal and you never want to open the terminal up, is there a distribution for you? Probably not. There's going to be always a time where terminal gets brought up sometime in your existence in your first month or two of using Linux. You'll need to get used to it. And it's amazing. I love the terminal in Linux better than any other operating system. It's more powerful. It can do anything, and it's fantastic. But at the downside of that, some of the GUI tools are less polished and have more bugs and don't work as well as the Windows and Mac counterparts. So I want to just say that out loud. Most things can be done in like a control panel or a GUI, but sometimes not, and you do need to use the terminal. Every once in a while, it's gotten better over recent years, but at the end of the day, most things that are built for the graphic user interface is built by a team of a handful of people. And it's not usually the best experience, and it's not as polished or clean as the Windows Mac counterpart. So just know terminals needed. And that graphics, sometimes those user interfaces are kind of half baked, or sometimes just omitting almost completely when it comes to like modifying users and things from a system level. Most times that is like terminal only. But the nice thing about this is, like, since it's an afterthought, usually the terminal's an afterthought in like Windows and Mac, things get just funky. Something's just thrown all over the system. In Linux, the beauty of it is all your config files are usually in two locations. If it's a user configuration, it's in your home folder, .config. So your home user.config is where all your user configuration resides for almost every application. How cool is that? You don't have to worry about where it's at on your system. Same, like if it's a system-wide configuration, it's going to be in /etc. etc is where all the system configuration pretty much resides. So if you're looking for a configuration for your bootloader, you're looking for a configuration for your networking, you're looking for a configuration for your package manager, it's almost all right here in etc. So those two things make Linux so much better than Windows, because Windows, when applications are doing it, and I know some people are, I lost you at the, GUI's sometimes not as polished. Well, it comes at the benefit of everything's kind of in two locations. If it's system-wide, I go to etc. If it's user-wide, I just go to home.config. It's freaking awesome. Like, how cool is finding configuration files and then easily setting whatever you want? So that's the beauty of Linux. Everything can be customized and it's in good locations. Oh, it's so much better than Windows and Mac in this regard. But on the downside is everything can be configured and everything can be customized. Linux will not protect you from yourself at all. So if you decide, hey, I'm going to delete my bootloader, Linux is going to be like, cool, I'll do that for you. Just send the command my way. That bootloader will be gone. And you'll be like, oh, my system doesn't boot anymore. Linux will be like, what? You told me what to do. I just did it. So there is no guardrails, and you can get into trouble a little bit faster. The next thing is applications in Linux are almost all free. So let's say, I roasted the whole Photoshop alternative earlier, and like I have Cursor installed. That's actually a paid program, well, paid monthly, I guess. So there is alternatives to that. Yes, you can install some paid stuff. It's just sometimes they don't have a paid counterpart. But I use GIMP a lot instead of Photoshop. So that's great. And I'm trying to get like Affinity working. Affinity, I'm hoping we'll get like some kind of Linux version of it. Right now, there's a heavy modification to kind of get it working, and it's not a great experience. So I still use GIMP for most of my image manipulation in my Linux counterpart. So, I still wish there was a better alternative to this that was maybe not even FOSS. But most things you'll hear is FOSS, which is free and open source software. And there's a lot of it in Linux. So there's always an alternatives, and you're going to be finding alternatives. Sometimes alternatives are better than the paid alternatives, which is great. But a lot of times that's not true. And the paid ones still win out, and you will probably end up booting back into Windows for those paid counterparts. Looking at you, Photoshop, and probably Microsoft Office, although you probably should look at alternatives right now. I'll make videos probably on alternatives and things I use daily coming up soon. So if you haven't subscribed, check it out. And if you like this video, sure and drop a like. Browser-based apps are probably a good alternative too. So a lot of times you could use something like G Suite. You could use something like Office Online if you need those applications. A lot of times in today's 2025 world, you can get your application working in your browser, which kind of fixes a lot of stuff, which is great. And that's kind of like the differences and the notable differences between Windows and Linux. There's definitely more, but these are like the biggest things that took me a while to wrap my brain around. Now, how programs are installed is just so much better than any other operating system. Everything's package manager based, almost, where you can just do like sudo apt install. So the big thing here is when you follow guides online, since there's so many different distributions and so many different package managers, just know sudo elevates it to system user. Do as, I think, is basically what that means. So it elevates it to a super user to level it. It's like run as admin in Windows. Apt is the package manager. If you're in Debian, it's going to be apt. So if you see sudo apt, in instructions online. That's a Debian, Ubuntu, a whole bunch of different distributions all use the app package manager. Arch is usually pacman, yay, paru. If you see sudo yay or sudo paru, that's referring to the package manager in Arch. And if you see DNF, sudo DNF, that's usually rel based. Now, there's a lot of other package managers. I'm not going to go into like OpenSUSE's or swapd and all these other ones. There's a ton of different ones for like more niche distros out there. But that's just know that's what that's referring to. Almost everything online uses Debian package manager. So if you're looking for like how-to articles, a lot of times it'll be sudo apt. But Arch does a very good job. And a lot of times those packages exist, but they just exist a little differently from Debian. So the apt and pacman, the packages are usually there, but sometimes they just didn't do a very good job at standardization, and the package name changes a little bit, even though it's the same package. I know that's confusing. The thing about Linux, though, is it's still Linux. No matter what you install, if it installs over on Debian, it's going to install over on Arch. It just might go a little bit differently, and you just got to know those nuances. Now, there are universal packages for Linux, like Flatpak, which is great. You have app images, and you also have snapds or snap packages. I don't like snaps, so I never use them. Not going to talk about them. But when it comes to Flatpaks and also app images, they're great. So I just used an app image yesterday, actually, on my Steam Deck because I needed to install something for Weak Auras. It was a World of Warcraft add-on. And I was like, oh, I need to get that companion app. And they had an app image, which means I could just go directly to their site, download that one file, and everything runs in that one container on any Linux system. So it didn't matter what distro I was on, which is great. And if you have like one-off programs like that, I honestly like App Image, and also Flatpak works the same way. Flatpak's a little bit better because it integrates more into your system and it can upgrade itself, which is fantastic, where App Image, you kind of have to maintain it yourself. But they're all self-contained, which is great, and they work on any distribution. So that's the good thing about Flatpak and App Image. So some programs out there will, and if you're getting into like game modding, there's now a lot of game modders that are doing like App Images and Flatpaks for your game, and that's great. I know there's a new version of something coming from Nexus Mods that's Linux-based for modding games, so it is getting a lot better. So now that we've gotten kind of like a gist of what's going on in Linux, let's talk about your typical Linux distribution and kind of what makes up a Linux distribution. Let's take one of the biggest common ones, an example. So usually Ubuntu, you have your bootloader, which could be Grub. Now there's also system deboot that you could use. You have your init system, which is almost every distribution out there says systemd. So you don't really need to know more than that, other than if systemd became like bad, or let's say you wanted a really minimal Linux install because systemd is kind of heavy. You could install like OpenRC, you could use Runit, you could use a lot of these other init systems because there's alternatives to everything in Linux. And you could just really make a really small Linux install that can just boot into a system very fast within seconds and run a specific program. That's what Linux just excels at. Display render, most things are Wayland nowadays. I'm not a huge Wayland fan. I'm actually using Xorg here, but usually it's Wayland or Xorg, and this will differentiate kind of how things are rendered on the screen. Now, Xorg's really old. People just scream at me and go, you're just an old man for liking Xorg, but it works really well for my system and for my use case today. So I still prefer Xorg. Eventually, I'll get with the new greatest hotness Wayland. But for today, I use primarily that. And most things you download and install that's mainstream is going to be Wayland going forward. So you should just know those two different things. And this is just how it's displayed on the screen. And then you have a display manager. Now, it says display manager, but really kind of think of this as like the login screen. This is what controls your boot process and what it is going to boot into. So the display manager kind of just manages the displays and then presents you with the login screen. So there's GDM, there's Light DM, there's SSD or SDDM, and there's a whole bunch more. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but those are like the big three, I would say. Mostly GDM and SDDM are the big ones, where SDDM is more KDE and GDM is more of your GNOME desktop environment. So what does that mean? Like, as far as like desktop environments, this is really the look and feel. As a new person, you're always like, I like the way this one distribution looks. Instead of switching distributions, you could just change the desktop environment. So there's KDE, which looks something like this. And then there's GNOME that looks kind of something like this. And you just kind of have to pick between the two. I would say stick to those two. Cinnamon is what Linux Mint uses, and it has its own display manager and own desktop environment called display. But there's other ones too that are even lightweight. It's just a lot of times they require more configuration and are less polished. But speaking of which, do you even need a desktop environment? You're like, Titus, what do you use? I don't use a desktop environment. I like to configure everything manually and just have a window manager, because at the end of the day, you don't really need all that fancy stuff. You could just have your windows and, just close out whatever you need. But the cool thing about window managers is there's a lot of those too. So a lot of different ways to display things and can kind of change the look and feel of it. So whether you want to control it all like me, or you want to start with something that's more tried and true, like a Mac Windows, kind of how they have like a giant environment with a control panel, with default programs and all these other things that kind of give you a basis to start with. That's why you always want to kind of start with a desktop environment when you first come to Linux. But eventually you're going to maybe move past that. You're going to go, you know what? I kind of want to just control it all myself. Now, my idea behind this is I want something very minimal, because I want my system to work every time, all the time, and I never have to worry about updates or something breaking, because at the end of the day, my DWM window manager, that's pretty ugly, but very minimal, it's roughly, I think, 100 kilobytes, and that's it. My entire system I boot into runs off of about 100 kilobytes. That's kind of insane, especially in the era of gigabytes, not megabytes, but gigabytes of stuff. And I don't even have one that's 1 megabyte. So if we come into here and we look at what I'm running, now this is the whole program with config files and the build, but really the only thing that gets run is this one file right here. It's 111 kilobytes, and it runs my entire system. All my window management happens with just that one binary. All of this extra stuff, when it compiles into this one file, and then it runs on the startup, and that's what we're in right now. 111 kilobytes. You just can't get any more efficient than that. But also, I like the simplicity of it to where I don't have to worry about my system ever breaking, because it's just this one thing. And if I don't recompile this, well, it's just always going to stay the same. There's no moving parts. There's no, I put a bad thing in the config file. Because if there's a bad thing in my config file, well, it wouldn't compile. And it never recompiles until I forcefully go in here and do it. So that's my process to it, but that's definitely not what you're going to start out with. But I kind of want to show you kind of like an in-game here. So that's kind of an example of configuration. With Ubuntu, they use Grub, Systemd, Wayland, GDM, and GNOME. That's typically where they start with. And if you look at like Kubuntu, it would be pretty much the same thing, but swap out GDM and GNOME with SDDM and KDE. And those would be the differences. So first install, I always recommend like a Debian ISO, because you're going to learn a lot during this installation, and you're going to be able to have a more stable environment, especially when it's like Linux Mint or something like that. Second install, I recommend Arch Linux. I learned the most I've ever learned by going through and installing Arch. There's a lot of guides out there. There's a lot of great things, but just follow this installation guide right here. It's very in-depth. It's not for the faint of heart, but by following this, you can kind of really understand every single little component of Linux. And it's every Linux desktop, you can apply a lot of these things. Like sometimes I'm in Debian and I'm like, God bless, you know what? let me check the Arch wiki because I remember changing that setting over in Arch, and the syntax might change a little bit between Debian and Arch, but for the most part, the concept's the same, and a lot of times the syntax doesn't really change a whole heck of a lot. Sometimes with like modifying the user and other things, it can change, but for the most part, the idea is there, and then it's just finding the right command to type it in. But very cool. That's why I always like the easiest installs, probably starting out with Debian, or even if you want to go even more basic than that, Linux Mint. But I don't think you're going to learn a whole bunch with Linux Mint. That's why I'm like, as a power user, I'd almost recommend you start with Debian and then move on to Arch. And then third installation, start with like the command line, getting in, just doing a window manager install without any desktop environment. And that's usually where a lot of people that have been using Linux for 5+ years end up, like myself. And I end up on something that I really like, that's super minimal, that just works every single time I boot my system up. I don't have to worry about things changing. It just works. And that's fantastic. But you can't start there, I don't think. I think you got to understand all these little nuances. And yeah, that's kind of the idea behind this whole series. So this was just to kind of start out Windows to Linux as a power user. Hopefully this explains a whole bunch for you guys that want to switch from Windows to Linux. These are the things I wish I knew before I started, but let me know what I missed, because Linux is a never-ending rabbit hole of possibilities and modifications and customizations that anything is possible. But how much work are you willing to put into it to make it a reality is the end thing about Linux. It's always just a blank canvas, and it's the ultimate thing of art. And I don't recommend just completely deleting Windows. Dual boot. I still dual boot. There's still things I jump into Windows for, and I still use Windows a lot. But Linux is where I'm most productive. It's where I'm most creative. It's where I can get the most work done. And if I didn't have Linux, I probably wouldn't even have this YouTube channel. So Linux is amazing. Learn it as a power user, but don't think it's going to be easy. And don't think it's the most stable, reliable thing, because Linux is only as stable as the person using it. And if you're brand new, you got to break it. So that's why I say do test environments. Test it out. But anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.